The village of Viridia lay in the shadow of rolling hills, shrouded in mist that clung to the cottages like a cautious veil. Travelers rarely came here, for the villagers were wary and talkative only in hushed tones. The air always carried an undertone of fear, as if every whisper, every creak of timber, was magnified into a warning. When a lone merchant arrived one evening, carrying his wares in a battered cart, the villagers whispered among themselves. Their glances flicked nervously toward a small, isolated house on the edge of the village, a place where no one ventured lightly. It was the home of Leora, a young girl who seemed different, whose presence caused unease that went beyond simple shyness or reclusiveness. Even the merchant, who had traveled through countless villages and cities, sensed the tension as he approached the market square. People avoided the main paths, crossing to the other side if he passed, and the elders spoke in tones that barely carried over the clatter of the evening wind. They poured poison in her cup, one woman whispered to another, eyes darting toward Leora's home, but the wine ate their throats. The merchant frowned, intrigued and alarmed. Rumors traveled quickly in Viridia, and this one seemed older than the current generation. Mothers tugged their children closer, and men straightened with suspicion when the girl's name was mentioned. Leora herself was visible only briefly from the threshold of her home. She was small and quiet, her dark hair falling in waves across her shoulders, eyes like shadowed pools reflecting both sorrow and strength. She moved with deliberate grace, as though every gesture had purpose and every step was measured. Even in the dim light of dusk, there was something unusual about the way she held herself. Not fear, not arrogance, but an awareness that she was neither entirely of the village nor entirely outside it. Children nearby whispered her name with fear and fascination, some daring to mimic her movements, while others ran to hide, convinced that to be noticed was dangerous. Elder Mara, the village's healer and the only one who had consistently treated Leora with kindness, emerged from the crowd. Her staff tapped lightly against the cobblestones as she moved toward the girl, offering a calm presence amid the tension. Mara had long known that Leora's lineage carried unusual gifts, though she kept this knowledge private. "Do not trouble the child," Mara said firmly, her voice carrying more authority than the villagers had heard in years. "She is as much a part of this land as the trees and the wind. To harm her is to invite the wrath of forces you cannot name." Her words were met with whispers and rolled eyes, as fear mingled with disbelief. The villagers wanted tangible proof of power, not the calm assurance of an elder. As night approached, the merchant found lodging at the inn, but sleep eluded him. Through the thin walls, he could hear strange sounds. A faint hum like the vibration of some unseen instrument rising and falling in the distance. He went outside to see a flicker of movement near Leora's home. Shadows danced against the walls, though no fire burned. From the forest's edge, a gentle wind carried an almost imperceptible scent of wine and spice, mingled with something more ancient, earthy, and unsettling. He shivered, wondering what kind of girl could command such subtle power, and why the villagers both feared and avoided her. Later, as the village settled into uneasy silence, a group of men gathered near the square, speaking in low tones about the upcoming festival. Their conversation turned to Leora, and one of them, Rammel, sneered. "A girl who sits in shadows thinks herself clever," he said. "Let us see what she does when forced to drink from the cup prepared for her. Surely even she cannot escape the consequences of poison." The others laughed, some nervously, some with cruel intent. They did not notice the leaves trembling lightly on the trees or the faint glimmer that ran along the cobblestones at their feet. These signs were subtle, warnings of a power that the villagers were only beginning to comprehend. Leora, inside her home, was aware of their plotting even before a word reached her ears. She moved with calm determination, placing her hands upon the surface of the old wooden table. The cup she drank from, simple, unassuming, yet imbued with protective enchantments passed down through her family, rested before her. She did not fear. Fear was a tool she had learned to control, to temper her emotions, and to read the intentions of those around her. Her mother's teachings echoed in her mind. Power without wisdom is destruction, anger without purpose is ruin, and cruelty always has a cost. As the evening deepened, the villagers' plotting continued, their voices rising and falling in anticipation. The merchant, unable to sleep and drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread, walked quietly toward the square. From his vantage point, he could see the faint glow of the cup on Leora's table, as if the liquid inside acknowledged her presence. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a low murmur that sounded almost like a warning. The balance of justice had not yet been met. Leora's calm, the village's plotting, and the unseen forces of protection and punishment all converged in a tense equilibrium that promised a reckoning, though none in Viridia could yet imagine its full magnitude. In that quiet, shadowed moment, the first signs of what was to come rippled through the village. The whisper of her name, the shivering leaves, the faint hum of energy, all hinted that the coming night would not be ordinary. The villagers who laughed at her innocence, who plotted her harm, were setting the stage for a confrontation that would leave no one untouched. And somewhere deep inside, Leora prepared herself not with fear, but with the calm knowledge that the cup, the wine, and the justice it carried had a mind of their own. Part 2. The village in Leora, 900 words, next. The village of Viridia was tucked into the rolling hills like a secret the world had almost forgotten. Fog clung to the cobblestone streets, drifting lazily over thatched roofs, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Travelers seldom lingered here. The villagers were wary of outsiders and even warier of one another. On this particular evening, a merchant arrived with a creaking cart laden with goods from distant towns, spices, fabrics, and trinkets that glittered faintly under the dying light. As he entered the square, the villagers watched from their doorways, eyes wide with suspicion, murmuring to each other in hushed tones. Every glance seemed to flicker toward one particular house at the edge of the village, its windows dark, its door shuttered, as though the structure itself held secrets. The girl who lived there was Leora. She was small, quiet, and unassuming, but her presence carried a weight the villagers could not define. Children whispered her name and darted behind fences when she passed, daring each other to watch her from afar. They poured poison in her cup, a woman said to her neighbor in a trembling voice, but the wine ate their throats. The merchant tilted his head, intrigued and uneasy as the story sank in. There was something in the air, something intangible that made his skin prickle. Even among his many travels, he had never felt a village so alive with caution, a place where fear hung so tangibly between breaths. From the threshold of her house, Leora appeared briefly, carrying herself with quiet dignity. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, deep and reflective, seemed to hold stories the village would never know. She moved with deliberate care, each step measured, each gesture precise, as if aware of the invisible currents of fear and attention that surrounded her. Despite the whispers and the sideways glances, she exuded neither arrogance nor terror. There was a stillness to her, a silent understanding that she was neither wholly part of the village nor wholly outside it. Elder Mara, the village healer and one of the few who treated Leora with kindness, emerged from the shadows. Her staff tapped lightly against the cobblestones, a rhythmic sound that carried authority. "Do not trouble her," she said firmly, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the gathering crowd. "The child is no threat to you. To harm her is to invite forces beyond your comprehension." Some villagers nodded reluctantly, while others scoffed, unable or unwilling to believe in powers they could not see. Yet even the skeptics felt a flicker of unease. Mara had lived longer than most, and her word carried weight that extended beyond simple respect. It carried caution, the kind born from knowledge and experience. The merchant, unable to ignore the tension, took a slow step closer to the square. Through the gaps between buildings, he glimpsed faint movements, shadows flickering unnaturally across walls, leaves rustling though the wind was still. There was a hum in the air, low and almost imperceptible, like the echo of some unseen instrument vibrating beneath the ground. He shivered as he realized that this village, small and ordinary by appearances, was charged with an energy that defied simple explanation. The girl at the edge of the village was at its center, the eye of a storm no one else could see. Nearby, a group of men spoke in low, conspiratorial tones, their attention fixed on Leora. Rammel, a brash and greedy villager, led the conversation, his words sharp and mocking. "She thinks herself clever," he sneered. "Let us see how she fares when we pour poison into her cup. Surely not even she can escape that fate." The others laughed, though uneasily, glancing at one another as if to confirm their complicity. The leaves on the trees quivered slightly, as if the very air was responding to their intent. Shadows stretched long and warped across the ground, creating shapes that seemed almost alive, warning that mischief carried consequences. Inside her home, Leora was aware of every movement, every whispered word. She did not flinch or tremble. The cup rested before her, simple yet significant, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was more than a vessel, it was a symbol of her heritage, a conduit for protection woven into her family's legacy. Her mother's lessons resonated in her mind. Power must be balanced with wisdom, anger must never dictate action, and cruelty always has a cost. She understood that the villagers' plotting was a reflection of their own hearts, and that the cup, the wine and the magic within it would reveal truth in due course. The evening deepened into night, and a quiet stillness fell over Viridia. The merchant watched from the inn's balcony, fascinated and apprehensive. He could feel the energy thrumming faintly beneath the village, a warning and a promise intertwined. The villagers continued to chatter in the square, unaware of the delicate balance being observed, as if the world itself held its breath. Leora, serene and poised, prepared for the inevitable reckoning that would test the morality and cruelty of those around her. The first whispers of power had begun, subtle yet undeniable, signaling that the coming hours would mark a turning point in the village's history, a lesson in justice that none would forget. That "Oh, you want me to proceed?" The village of Viridia was small, a cluster of modest homes woven together by narrow streets and cobbled paths. Moss grew thick in the spaces between the stones, and the air smelled of smoke from hearth fires mingled with the damp scent of the nearby forest. Life moved slowly here, ruled as much by superstition as by seasons. Villagers believed that misfortune could be traced to unseen forces, that spirits watched constantly, and that any deviation from custom could invite calamity. Every family had stories of misfortune avoided or visited upon those who dared to anger the unseen, and Leora's presence in their midst had long been a source of quiet unease. Leora lived in a small house at the very edge of the village, where the forest began to thicken and the cobblestone paths gave way to wildflowers and mossy earth. Orphaned at a young age, she had grown up in solitude, save for the occasional lessons Elder Mara provided. The villagers viewed her with suspicion, whispering about her strange resilience, her calm demeanor, and the way the animals of the forest seemed drawn to her. Children, fearless in their innocence yet cruel in their curiosity, mocked her openly. They followed her at a distance, calling her names and daring one another to throw stones or sticks, hoping to provoke a reaction. But Leora remained quiet, her eyes steady and her steps deliberate, unaffected by their petty cruelty. Despite the fear and mockery surrounding her, Leora's kindness was evident in her actions. She would collect injured birds and rabbits, feeding and tending to them until they were strong enough to return to the wild. She watered the wildflowers growing along the edge of the village, sometimes leaving small bouquets outside the homes of elderly villagers as a silent gift. Yet even these simple gestures were misunderstood. Villagers interpreted her compassion as strange, unnatural, and sometimes threatening. Her presence blurred the line between the ordinary and the uncanny, reinforcing the superstition that had kept the village wary for generations. Elder Mara was the only person who showed Leora consistent warmth and guidance. A woman of remarkable experience, Mara had lived long enough to see patterns others could not, to sense energy and intention beyond the ordinary. She recognized the unusual gift that had marked Leora from birth and took it upon herself to teach the girl both wisdom and restraint. Mara's lessons were subtle. She would speak of the forest's rhythms, the movement of the stars, and the importance of listening before acting. Through her guidance, Leora learned not only to care for the living but to understand the delicate balance between kindness and consequence, between action and inaction. The villagers' suspicion was reinforced by old stories. They whispered that Leora's mother had been a woman of unusual talents who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and that her father was unknown. Such gaps in her lineage made the villagers uncomfortable. Mystery, after all, was often interpreted as danger. They watched Leora with eyes sharpened by superstition, ready to misinterpret any harmless action as evidence of power that should be feared or suppressed. Even adults, who had experienced years of hardship and understood reason in other matters, were swayed by these tales. The village became a place where fear and rumor outweighed logic, and Leora's mere existence unsettled the fragile balance of daily life. Children, in particular, could not resist teasing her. They trailed behind her in the streets, mimicking her careful movements, tugging at her skirts, or tossing pebbles in her path. Leora rarely reacted. When she did, it was with quiet precision, a glance that conveyed disappointment rather than anger. In rare moments she spoke to them softly, teaching without reprimand, trying to instill understanding. Often the children would run, unnerved by her calm authority. This only heightened the villagers' suspicion, reinforcing the idea that she wielded power beyond their comprehension. Despite this isolation, Leora found companionship in the creatures of the forest and in the natural rhythms surrounding the village. Birds would land near her shoulder, deer would linger at the forest edge, and even the wind seemed to bend around her presence. These quiet allies became her friends, her teachers, and her witnesses. She understood them intuitively, sensing their moods and needs, responding with a harmony that the villagers could neither see nor understand. To them, such communion seemed unnatural, further fueling their fear and superstition. Elder Mara continued to nurture Leora's growth, teaching her small but essential lessons of survival, insight, and ethical power. Kindness is strength, Leora, Mara would say, but remember that strength is a responsibility. The world will test you, sometimes cruelly, and you must be prepared to answer with wisdom, not just instinct. These words became Leora's guiding principles, shaping the quiet resilience and controlled power that would later define her presence. Mara's guidance was the one tether to stability in a village otherwise consumed by suspicion and fear. Though her days were often lonely, Leora's life at the edge of the village was filled with quiet purpose. She tended plants, cared for animals, and learned from Mara's wisdom. Every action, every gesture, reinforced a sense of self-discipline and understanding, qualities that the villagers misread as aloofness or strangeness. Leora lived in a delicate balance, existing on the margins yet observing all, learning, and preparing herself for a world that would soon demand more than passive endurance. The village continued its rhythms, unaware that the girl they feared and whispered about quietly commanded forces they could not yet perceive. Leora's kindness, resilience, and wisdom were growing steadily, like a spark beneath the surface, ready to illuminate the darkness that fear and cruelty had created. Proceed? The village of Viridia had long been accustomed to quiet routines, yet beneath its orderly appearance simmered envy and malice. Leora's presence, serene and unassuming, unsettled many. While she spoke little and interfered less, her calm intelligence, innate kindness, and subtle charm drew attention in ways the villagers could not fully understand. People whispered about her, wondering why the animals of the forest followed her steps, why flowers seemed to flourish along the path she walked, and why her mere presence seemed to temper the village's tensions. Among those who observed her closely, envy stirred like a slow poison, growing steadily until it could no longer be contained. Rammel was the leader of those most unsettled by her quiet authority. A man in his late 20s, broad-shouldered and loud, he had long sought to assert dominance over the villagers, yet Leora's calm demeanor and the respect she commanded challenged him. He could not bear that a mere girl, seemingly fragile and without connections, could wield such influence without effort. Each glance from her, each act of unnoticed kindness, seemed to undermine his authority. Whispered complaints among his followers reinforced his growing resentment. Why should she, an orphan girl at the edge of the village, earn admiration while he labored and schemed for status? The jealousy coiled within him like a serpent, hungry for release. The annual village feast provided the opportunity Rammel had been waiting for. The entire village gathered in the central square, stalls filled with food and drink, fires burning, and laughter floating in the cool evening air. Leora, as always, was on the outskirts, tending quietly to the animals that had wandered into the square or speaking softly with Elder Mara about herbs and remedies. She moved with discretion, avoiding the central commotion and remaining politely distant from the bustling crowd. Yet her presence did not go unnoticed. Rammel's eyes followed her constantly, noting her grace, the careful way she carried herself, and the faint sparkle in her dark eyes that seemed to defy the ordinary. Rammel gathered a small group of his most loyal friends, all men who shared his resentment and fear. They whispered together in a corner, plotting humiliation. "Tonight," Rammel said, his voice low but tinged with cruel delight, "we will remind her, and the rest of them, that respect must be earned, not granted by nature. If she thinks her quiet ways protect her, we will show her otherwise." His followers nodded, a mixture of nervousness and excitement in their expressions. They had long been complicit in his schemes, yet none had witnessed a display like this before. The plan was simple: poison her wine, embarrass her in front of the entire village, and reduce the girl they feared to tears and submission. As the feast progressed, the villagers were immersed in music, dance, and laughter, unaware of the brewing plot. Rammel and his conspirators prepared the poisoned cup, carefully choosing a dark, bitter substance that had been stored in secrecy for such occasions. The liquid shimmered faintly in the candlelight as they poured it into a goblet, pretending to offer it as part of a toast. Rammel grinned, imagining the astonishment and fear that would spread across her delicate features when she unknowingly raised it to her lips. The men whispered among themselves, laughing at the thought, eager to witness the girl's humiliation and to regain some measure of dominance in their small world. Leora, guided by intuition and the subtle wisdom instilled by Elder Mara, sensed the danger. She paused near the table where the cup waited, feeling a subtle shift in the air, a vibration that spoke of malice and ill intent. Her fingers hovered over the goblet, her dark eyes narrowing with quiet focus. Yet she said nothing, making no sudden movements, giving no hint that she knew the plot. Her restraint was deliberate. She understood that the moment required patience. The cup, attuned to her spirit, pulsed faintly with warmth, a reassuring sign that the protective enchantments were aware and ready. The villagers around her continued their revelry, oblivious to the tension building in that small corner of the feast. Some glanced at Leora with curiosity, others with suspicion, but none recognized the silent threat in Rammel's actions. The air seemed to grow heavier, as if the unseen forces that watched over her were coiling, waiting. Children, who had once mocked her in the streets, now watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, sensing the unusual energy that pulsed from her presence. Even the animals that had wandered into the square were tense, ears perked, bodies poised, as if they too felt the dangerous intent surrounding her. Finally, Rammel presented the cup to Leora, laughing and gesturing for the entire village to watch. "A toast," he called, his voice dripping with mockery. "To the quiet girl who thinks herself clever, may she taste what it means to defy us." Leora's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. She lifted the cup in her hands, aware of every intent behind it, aware of the cruelty and ignorance she faced. Her calm was almost tangible, radiating a silent authority that unsettled the men even as they laughed. At that moment, the air seemed to shiver. A subtle, almost imperceptible hum emanated from the cup itself, as if acknowledging both threat and innocence. Rammel's laughter rang through the square, mingling with the music and chatter of the festival, yet beneath it lay a tension that none could name. The villagers watched, sensing that something unseen had shifted. Leora raised the cup to her lips, slow and deliberate, and in that quiet act, the balance of power began to tilt. The malicious intent, the envy, and the cruelty that had been carefully plotted were about to meet consequences far beyond mortal comprehension. In that moment, the feast became a stage, the villagers unwitting actors in a drama that had been set centuries before, and Leora, the quiet girl at the edge of their lives, prepared to demonstrate the true weight of her heritage. "Proceed?" The village feast was alive with music, laughter, and the smell of roasted meat drifting over the square, yet beneath the revelry, a tension coiled like a hidden serpent. Leora stood at the edge of the gathering, poised and calm, her dark eyes observing the crowd, every movement and murmur sharpening her awareness. She had sensed the malicious intent long before the poisoned cup was placed in her hands, feeling a subtle vibration in the air, a ripple of cruelty that spoke of plotting and envy. Yet she did not panic. Calm had become her shield, patience her weapon. The conspirators, led by Rammel, moved with false cheer, confident in their plan. They exchanged sly glances, whispering promises of humiliation and dominance, certain that Leora's innocence would be her undoing. The cup, resting before her, seemed ordinary, but Leora knew better. Its protective enchantments pulsed faintly, resonating with her own quiet power. She lifted it slowly, deliberately, allowing every villager who dared watch to witness the movement, their anticipation thick in the evening air. As the goblet rose to her lips, something shifted. The liquid inside shimmered and darkened, responding not to the poison, but to the intent behind it. Leora's calm focus, her refusal to harbor hatred, and the cup's protective magic combined to transform the would-be poison into something far more potent. The liquid glowed faintly, catching the flickering light of torches and fire pits, as if aware of the malicious eyes upon it. She did not drink. Instead, she allowed the cup to be taken by Rammel and his accomplices, who, blinded by arrogance and cruelty, raised it to their own lips. Their laughter echoed through the square, brash and confident, carrying the ignorance of those who believed they controlled the moment. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The wine, empowered by the cup and attuned to the malice that flowed from their hearts, transformed from liquid into a force that consumed from within. The men's laughter faltered, replaced by sharp, guttural cries as the substance burned through them, ignoring the protections they had assumed they possessed. Panic erupted in their eyes as the square was suddenly filled with screams of pain and terror. The wine did not harm Leora, for her intentions were pure, but the poison reflected the cruelty aimed at her, turning against those who sought to harm the innocent. Villagers froze, a wave of shock and horror washing over the crowd. Some stumbled backward, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The sound of agony and choking filled the night air, mingling with the frightened cries of children and the confused braying of animals caught near the chaos. Torches flickered as if in sympathy, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. Those who had once dismissed Leora's calm now recognized, too late, that her power was neither imagined nor harmless. The girl they had feared quietly had exacted justice in a manner that left no ambiguity. Rammel's eyes widened in disbelief, his body writhing as he clawed at his throat. He gasped and coughed violently, realizing that the laughter and confidence that had filled him moments before were now being replaced by panic, agony, and a profound terror that no sword or plan could counter. His companions suffered similarly, screams piercing the night as the square became a chaotic tableau of fear, blood, and smoke. Villagers who had stood at a distance began to step back, some tripping over cobblestones, others shielding their eyes, but none could intervene. The power at work was not theirs to stop. Amid the chaos, Leora remained calm, a serene presence that contrasted starkly with the panic surrounding her. Her dark eyes swept the square, taking in the horror, yet her heart carried no malice. She did not celebrate, she simply acknowledged the balance restored. The cup had responded to cruelty, to malice, and to the intent to harm. It had acted as a mirror, reflecting the consequences of actions designed to wound the innocent. Children watched in wide-eyed fascination, their earlier teasing now replaced by a cautious awe. They sensed that something greater than human understanding had just intervened. Elder Mara emerged from the shadows, staff in hand, moving quickly to ensure that the panic did not spiral into further disaster. She guided frightened villagers to safety, her presence calm and commanding. "It is done," she murmured to Leora, her voice barely audible over the screams. "The innocent are protected. The cruel are punished. Remember this night, it will teach the village lessons they cannot yet name." Leora nodded silently, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. She understood that what had just occurred was not simply vengeance. It was balance, a correction written into the natural order and empowered by her heritage. When the screams subsided, the square was a scene of aftermath, scorched lips, clawed throats, and trembling bodies of those who had sought to harm her. The villagers who had not participated directly in the plot were shaken, some fainting, others clutching each other in fear. They whispered among themselves, unable to voice the truth clearly, only capable of repeating the story they had just witnessed. "The wine, it ate their throats. She did not touch it yet." The words trailed off, leaving fear suspended in the night air. Leora lowered the cup gently back onto the table, untouched and intact, as if acknowledging that the lesson had been delivered. Her dark eyes swept the square once more, taking note of the fear, the awe, and the unspoken realization that power existed in ways far beyond ordinary comprehension. The villagers now understood, even if only instinctively, that cruelty carried consequences they could neither predict nor control. And Leora, the quiet girl at the edge of the village, had become the living embodiment of that truth, a presence to be respected, feared, and ultimately understood. Proceed? After the chaos of the feast, Leora knew she could no longer remain in the village. Even those who had admired her from afar were now wary, eyes filled with fear and suspicion. Whispers followed her as she left the square, the stories of the wine and its terrible justice spreading faster than the flames of a wildfire. The villagers, though shaken, were not capable of understanding the forces at play. Their fear was tangible, a heavy, pressing weight that made Leora realize that her presence, no matter how innocent, would always provoke danger among those who lacked wisdom. She resolved to seek refuge where the world's laws were governed less by superstition and more by understanding, and where her powers could grow in safety. The forest stretched beyond the village like a protective barrier, thick with towering oaks and pines, and veined with narrow streams that glittered in the sunlight. Leora moved silently, her feet guided by instinct as much as knowledge. She had spent years observing the land's rhythms, understanding the subtle signals of birds, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind. These lessons became her compass as she ventured deeper, leaving behind the world that had not been ready to accept her. The forest welcomed her quietly, sensing her calm, her purpose, and her respect for life. Even the shadows seemed to bend in acknowledgement, allowing her passage along hidden paths and forgotten glades. Days became weeks as Leora settled into the forest, learning to attune herself to its ancient rhythms. The spirits that had whispered through the stories of her mother now appeared in forms she could perceive, flickers of light among the leaves, shimmering figures in the mist, and voices carried on the wind that spoke in riddles yet conveyed truth. They guided her in subtle ways, showing her how to channel the power within her without letting it consume her. Leora discovered that her abilities were not simply reactive, they were communicative. The forest itself responded to her emotions and intentions, aligning with her thoughts when they were pure, correcting when they were unbalanced, and revealing the interconnectedness of all living things. Through meditation, observation, and practice, she honed her skill over the subtle magic inherited from her lineage. She learned to sense the intentions of those who approached, to detect malice before it manifested, and to shield herself from harm with delicate wards she could summon with thought alone. Flames, winds, and whispers of spirits became tools she could call upon with precision, not out of vengeance, but as instruments of balance. She practiced for hours, testing limits, observing consequences, and refining control, aware that any misuse of her power could result in devastation. The forest animals became her companions and teachers. Birds perched on her shoulders and shoulders of her mind alike, carrying news from distant trees and hidden clearings. Wolves watched silently at the edges of her encampment, respecting her calm authority, while smaller creatures revealed hidden paths and secrets she could not otherwise have known. Every interaction reinforced the bond she shared with the natural world, strengthening her understanding of cause and effect, intention and consequence. She realized that her inherited powers were not merely for self-protection. They existed to protect the innocent and to serve as a check against cruelty, just as her mother had once used them. As months passed, Leora's mastery over the subtle magic deepened. She could now influence the flow of air and water in precise ways, conjure protective barriers invisible to the untrained eye, and guide the spirits of the forest to intervene where human justice failed. She experimented with her abilities on small scales. A rogue branch redirected before it fell on a hidden path, a stream nudged slightly to water a grove of seedlings, whispers carried to a bird in need of guidance. Each success, each controlled demonstration of her abilities, reinforced the understanding that her powers were extensions of her own intent, reflections of her ethical alignment, and not mere tools for revenge. The cup from her home, preserved through careful concealment, remained a constant reminder of her lineage and purpose. In its presence she felt the hum of ancestral guidance, the protection of her mother's legacy, and the quiet affirmation of the spirits who had once whispered to her in stories and dreams. Leora came to understand that her life was intertwined with the unseen world, that the actions of humans were always mirrored in the balance of nature, and that she bore a responsibility to maintain that balance. In her solitude, she also reflected upon the villagers who had sought to harm her. Though they were far from her reach, their intentions had left a trace, and her powers allowed her to sense their growth, fear, and remorse. She realized that justice did not require destruction. It required patience, observation, and the occasional intervention when cruelty threatened the innocent. The lessons she learned in the forest, guided by elemental spirits and the whispers of her mother's lineage, were profound. She was becoming more than human yet not less, an intermediary between the natural and the human world, a guardian and a teacher of balance. By the end of her first year in exile, Leora had grown into a figure of quiet command. The forest itself seemed to recognize her presence, bending paths to ease her travels, calling birds to deliver messages, and carrying her whispers to those who required guidance. Though isolated from human society, she was deeply connected to the unseen currents that ran through the world. Her understanding of magic, spirits, and the subtle mechanisms of justice had become profound, preparing her for the day she would return or intervene in the village that had once sought to harm her. She had learned not only the full potential of her powers but also the wisdom to wield them responsibly, ensuring that innocence was protected and cruelty punished. Seasons changed in Viridia, carrying the village through the familiar rhythm of planting and harvest, festival and fasting, yet the people noticed that the ordinary flow of life had shifted. Crops that had once thrived in well-tended fields suddenly withered, their leaves curling and browning despite the careful work of the villagers. Grain stored in clay jars would rot inexplicably, even when sealed properly, leaving pantry shelves bare and families anxious. Livestock, once healthy and robust, fell ill for no discernible reason. Chickens would sicken overnight, goats stumbled in fields, and calves were found trembling and weak before the sun rose. Superstition deepened as these events seemed random yet connected, patterns emerging in the whispers of those who dared speculate. "They say the cup remembers," murmured an old woman at the market, voice quivering as she glanced toward Leora's former home at the edge of the village. Her words were repeated in hushed tones among neighbors and friends, echoing across cobblestone streets and narrow alleys. Children, wide-eyed and silent, passed the warnings along to one another in trembling whispers. Even the adults, rational in other matters, found themselves unnerved by these subtle yet persistent occurrences. The village, long accustomed to blaming misfortune on luck or the spirit's whims, now faced an unease that carried a personal edge, a sense that some hidden force was observing, judging, and waiting. From her refuge in the forest, Leora observed quietly. She had not returned to the village, understanding that her presence might inflame fear or provoke further cruelty. Yet she could sense the subtle disturbances rippling through the land and among the villagers. The cup, kept carefully hidden and safeguarded in her camp, pulsed faintly with resonance. It reflected not only her own intentions but the latent malice and heedlessness that lingered in the hearts of those who had sought to harm her. Its magic was active, subtle yet powerful, influencing events in ways that ensured the innocent were protected while the negligent and cruel felt the gentle pressure of consequence. The villagers, growing increasingly anxious, began to notice patterns that defied rational explanation. Their tools would break at critical moments, fires that should have stayed contained would flare uncontrollably, and streams that supplied water for the fields would dry or flood seemingly without cause. Panic mingled with superstition, making every mundane event a possible omen. Markets slowed, people whispered more frequently, and trust among neighbors frayed. Old tensions resurfaced as blame was cast on anyone nearby, while the words of the elderly healer Mara, once a calming influence, were dismissed as the ramblings of someone who could not alter the unseen forces that now dominated the village's reality. Stories of the girl with the cup, Leone, reached even those who had not seen her firsthand. Her quiet strength, her serenity during the feast, and the miraculous vengeance of the poisoned wine were remembered, exaggerated, and retold in hushed tones around fires and in kitchens. "Do not anger her," parents warned children, their faces pale and serious. "The cup remembers." The phrase became a refrain, a warning woven into everyday life. Though some dismissed it as superstition, even skeptics could not deny the unbroken chain of misfortune coinciding with Leora's absence. The village seemed to breathe uneasily, each day heavier with the knowledge that an unseen justice had been set in motion. Despite the disturbances, Leone maintained strict restraint. From her hidden glade in the forest, she observed without acting impulsively, testing her understanding and the limits of the cup's influence. She could feel the ebb and flow of malice, the subtle tremors of greed, fear, and cruelty. Yet she did not intervene unnecessarily. Her power was not meant to punish indiscriminately, it was meant to correct, to restore balance, and to protect those who could not protect themselves. Each act of destruction or misfortune was measured, a precise response to maintain equilibrium rather than to instill terror. Her observations also deepened her understanding of the villagers' character. The more she watched, the more she saw the complexity of human emotion, the mix of guilt and fear among those who had harmed her, the innocence of children caught in the currents of superstition, and the desperation of families struggling with misfortune. Leora's restraint was born not of inexperience but of wisdom. She understood that indiscriminate vengeance could destroy more than the guilty, it could unravel the fragile lives of innocents who had no part in the cruelty. Over the years, the villagers grew to live in quiet fear, their behavior subtly altered by the knowledge that they were being observed. Children walked carefully, mindful of their words and deeds. Adults hesitated before acting harshly toward one another, feeling the invisible presence of judgment. Stories of Leone became moral lessons, told in hushed tones to impress caution and respect for unseen forces. Superstition intertwined with ethics, producing a culture of careful consideration and hesitant kindness, even among those who had once been openly cruel. Through it all, Leora's own life unfolded with steady discipline. She refined her control over the cup's enchantments, deepened her understanding of the spirits she communicated with, and strengthened her bond with the natural world. The forest became her home, her sanctuary, and her classroom. From this vantage point, she witnessed the subtle interplay of human action and supernatural consequence, realizing that her inherited powers were not only a defense but a teaching tool. Each ripple of misfortune in the village was a reminder that justice need not roar to be heard. It could whisper through missteps, guiding the ignorant and restraining the malevolent without unnecessary cruelty. And so years passed in quiet tension. The village remained intact but uneasy, a place where the stories of the girl with the cup shaped behavior and perception. Leone watched from afar, her calm presence a stabilizing influence unseen, her wisdom tempered by patience, and her powers growing with each observation. The land itself seemed to hum with her watchful vigilance, a subtle but persistent reminder that the innocent were protected, the cruel were checked, and that every action carried consequences beyond human comprehension. Years of careful observation and quiet vigilance had shaped Leone into a figure of precise, measured power. Her mastery over her inherited abilities and her understanding of the cup's enchantments allowed her to act with intention, balancing mercy with justice. Though she had spent much of her life in the forest, unseen and distant, the village of Viridia remained within her awareness, a place still bound by fear, superstition, and the memory of her earlier trial. Now, with her powers honed and fully controlled, she prepared for the first opportunity to influence the village once more, whether through direct action or subtle intervention. The first signs appeared gradually. Fields that had struggled for months began to bloom unexpectedly, wheat rippling in synchronized waves as if touched by an unseen hand. Streams that had run low or muddied by neglect turned clear and abundant, their banks alive with waterfowl returning to feed. Flowers sprouted in previously barren soil, vibrant and unusual in color, drawing the villagers' attention. At first they marveled, attributing the change to a rare combination of weather and care. Yet soon they noticed patterns too precise to be accidental. Crops flourished most abundantly where the villagers had been kindest to each other, while areas plagued by selfishness or cruelty seemed slower to respond. The connection was subtle but undeniable. Leora's return, whether physical or metaphysical, was not always visible. Sometimes it was signaled by small cryptic omens, a raven perched on a roof watching as if carrying her gaze, a soft gust of wind that nudged seeds into fertile ground, or the faint shimmer of the cup's magic reflected in a pool of water. Villagers began whispering again of the girl with the cup, their fear mingled with awe. Those who remembered the feast years earlier were particularly sensitive to the signs. "She watches still," they said quietly in the markets, speaking in hushed tones so that children might overhear and learn caution. The presence of Leora, though largely unseen, influenced behavior in ways more profound than her prior interventions. However, Leora's actions were not limited to blessing. She exercised judgment where cruelty persisted. Villagers who sought to harm others, cheat, or deceive experienced consequences that were immediate and unmistakable, yet never lethal unless their intent was extreme. A man who attempted to steal livestock found his hands blistered and scorched until he repented. A group plotting to ruin the harvest discovered their stored grains infested and spoiled overnight. Each intervention was measured, precise, and clearly tied to the intentions behind the misdeed. Mercy was shown where acknowledgement and remorse were present, punishment where cruelty or malice was deliberate. The balance of justice was her guiding principle, and her control over her powers ensured that no innocent suffered for the actions of the guilty. Leora's presence also nurtured subtle reconciliation in the village. Villagers who had once been cruel or envious began to see the impact of their actions, noticing how fields prospered when generosity and cooperation were practiced. Fear remained a factor, but it was tempered by respect and a growing understanding that invisible forces could correct wrongdoing without overt confrontation. Children in particular learned caution, empathy, and attentiveness to their surroundings. They told stories of small, inexplicable miracles, such as water appearing where parched crops needed it most or fireflies gathering in shapes reminiscent of protective symbols. These events carried the implicit lessons of restraint, awareness, and ethical behavior. One evening, Leora appeared physically at the edge of the village during a quiet moment at dusk. Her dark eyes, calm and unwavering, swept across the square, taking note of the villagers' actions. A few recognized her silhouette, hearts racing with a mix of fear and reverence. She said nothing, spoke no words, and yet the presence itself communicated authority and expectation. Those who had previously plotted harm felt a chill, their ill intentions curdling into unease, while those who had shown kindness or caution felt warmth, reassurance, and encouragement. Leora's controlled presence emphasized the dual nature of her power: protection for the innocent, correction for the unjust, and balance for all who fell in between. The cup, ever by her side, reflected her mastery. It no longer pulsed faintly in reaction to every minor thought, it resonated in harmony with her focused intentions. When she intervened, it amplified her power precisely, enforcing justice without excess. Villagers who once feared her for spontaneous vengeance now recognized the measured nature of her actions, though they still approached her with caution and respect. Tales of the girl with the cup became more than mere warnings. They transformed into lessons in moral discernment, humility, and restraint, passed down with reverence to the younger generations. Throughout this period, Leora maintained a careful balance between visible intervention and hidden guidance. At times, she subtly influenced events from afar: a fire prevented from spreading to homes by an invisible force, a harsh wind redirecting a falling tree, or whispers carried on the breeze guiding villagers away from dangerous paths. Her mercy was deliberate, her judgment precise, and her presence, whether direct or indirect, ensured that the village experienced both accountability and protection in equal measure. By the end of her return, whether momentary or ongoing, the villagers of Viridia had been transformed. The landscape thrived, ethical behavior was subtly reinforced, and the lessons of consequence became woven into the fabric of daily life. Leora's mastery of her powers demonstrated that justice could be administered without cruelty, that mercy could coexist with punishment, and that restraint was often the most profound expression of strength. The girl who had once been mocked, endangered, and tested had become a figure of wisdom and authority, shaping her world in ways both visible and unseen, leaving a legacy that would endure long after her presence faded. "Do you want me to proceed?"